Hi, everyone. This is Riley Bounds with Solum Podcast. We talk about art, philosophy, and spiritual formation. And today I have Laurie Klein with me. Hey, Laurie.
Hi.
Yeah, well, good to see you. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, um, I'm a writer, and sometimes I try not to be, and then I always have to go back to it again. I think I'm in love with a quote lately from Sumunk Kid, who says, let me check the wording, grace needs an arena in which to incarnate.
Hmm.
And I would really like to be that open and that available to the Spirit of God to hear and to be able to understand things a little more, express things a little more. I want to connect with God. I want to connect with people. Those things are actually more important to me than where I publish. Um, I really don't want to miss out on the daily marvels that are around me. And, oh, those little felicitous whispers that are there if you pause long enough to hear them. I guess I guess I want to live a life of contagious reverence
Hmm.
that's radical in a gentle way because I'm old. So it needs to be gentle. But if I think about, my little patch or my little beach that I live and dream on, I really hope that the footprints that mark out a path are filling up with clear water that reflects a little bit of sky.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that's great. I think that like artists tend to get wrapped up in what they do as part of their identity. And it is part of their identity, but it's not the whole of their identity. So I think it's kind of refreshing that you frame it that way as opposed to making it like everything, you know?
Mm,
Yeah. Well, I think that people already know this, but you wrote the chorus of "I Love You, Lord."
yeah.
Um, that's quite a big deal. It's one of the biggest worship songs ever. So I guess just kind of how did that come about? And did you know that it would like skyrocket off like it did?
Oh my goodness, no. But first, let me tell you how it happened. And I guess that's one of my little paths where the footprints are still filling up with water. Um, it was 1975, and my husband Bill and I moved to Bend, Oregon, which is a sort of low desert environment. And
Hmm.
he was attending forestry school. But we were so poor. We lived in a single wide trailer along the highway, and the tumbleweeds careened by through the sagebrush, just acres of sagebrush and roaring semis. And we lived on $400 a month, and 150 of that was rent. We had no friends. There was a couple nearby. Their name was Chuck and Hazel, and they were ancient, but they were sweet.
Hmm.
But I'm home all day alone with a toddler, and Bill is in school, and we don't have the extra money for a long distance phone call. We're eating really low on the food chain. Um, I know enough to get up every morning before the baby and send my husband off to school with a lunch, and then pick up my guitar and sing, try to read the word a little. And day by day goes by, and I'm pretty faithful to that. But there comes a time where you just go numb.
Hmm.
And there was a morning where I sat down with my guitar by the little chintzy fireplace in this trailer, and I couldn't think of a single song that expressed what my heart was feeling.
Hmm.
Love for my maker, desire to praise him, but I was so empty. Um, I did have the presence of mind to pray, and it was something along the lines of, um, Lord, you're worthy. I would love to worship you today, but if you want to hear something, could you just give me a song or something to say? Because I got nothing.
Hmm.
And I was holding my guitar, and I started noodling the way you do. And boy, it was not long at all before I had two lines of lyrics and chords and a melody. They just rolled out. And I remember thinking, maybe I should write that down.
Hmm.
And so I did, because I have a tendency to forget things pretty quickly. And then I thought maybe there would be a little more if I took some thought and some experimentation. And the next two lines came fairly readily. Uh, and all of this before the baby woke up. And, it was just a gift. It was an incredible gift, and it was incredibly private.
Hmm.
You asked, did I know it would travel? And my goodness, no. I did sing it for my husband,
Hmm.
and he liked it a lot. And a former pastor, came to visit us because he knew we were discouraged living out in the low desert. And um, Bill urged me to sing it for him, and I reluctantly did. He is a musician. I don't remember him taking any notes.
Hmm.
Um, but unbeknownst to us, several months later, he took I Love You, Lord to the International Convention of the Foursquare denomination.
Hmm.
It became the theme song of the whole convention, which meant
Wow.
all those attendees took the song across the world. We still
Hmm.
didn't know anything about it until Bill was doing a solo coffee house, and the warm up band said, "Hey, we learned this great song we want to teach you. We learned it from some guys from Indonesia." And it was I Love You, Lord. And not long after that, we got a phone call from an agent for Annie Herring of the second chapter of Acts. And she wanted to know, did we own the rights to the song? Because she wanted to use it on a children's album. I think the title was Kids of the Kingdom.
Hmm.
Well, we hadn't copyrighted it. Um, but Bill had the presence of mind to say, yes, it's ours. And no sooner did he hang up than he researched how to copyright the song. So, it was nothing planned, it was nothing branded, it was nothing marketed. And here we are 48 years later. And every few months, I continue to meet someone or hear from someone who seeks me out who has a story about that song.
Hmm.
And I have an idea it carries some sort of a a I don't know, a shine on it, or like God kissed it or something, especially for people who are going through a bad time.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I do hear a lot about that song. I mentioned you to a friend of mine, and I mentioned that you wrote that song. And he was like, "Really? I've heard that song ever since I grew up." So yeah, it's really making waves. It's made waves for the last 50 years. So
Uh,
yeah.
it's
Um,
amazing.
have you kept up on songwriting in that time?
Oh, thank you for asking that. I do write songs when I walk. I have pretty bad arthritis now, so I don't play instruments anymore. So I
Hmm.
think of it more as a private journal. However, um, I have collaborated with a few musicians, and very recently, I sent some lyrics to Dr. Benjamin Brody, who's just a whiz bang hymnologist.
Hmm.
So, kind of out of the chorus genre, more into hymnody. And he composed such an evocative, beautiful tune and arrangement. And so that came out the same month as my latest book. And it's called At the Weaving of Creation is the hymnal, and Holy God, Commune with Us is the title. So
Hmm.
that's kind of it. It's very, once in a while, I collaborate with someone and provide some lyrics. I
Okay.
guess that's a way of keeping your hand in, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And with poetry, because you're also a very well-known poet, when did you start transitioning to that?
Again, it was catastrophe and trial. My dad died in 1996,
Hmm.
and it was such an acutely complex, layered grief that I needed to write things down to process them, but I needed manageable chunks.
Hmm.
And uh, a poem gave me that leeway, but I really needed help because poetry's a different language than songwriting. They're, second cousins maybe, but God brought the most wonderful gift into my life. Her name is Susan Cowger. She's a visual artist. She's a poet, excellent poet. Um, and she began to work with me, and I just considered myself her apprentice.
Hmm.
And here we are 28 years later, and we've been writing partners all this time, coming to a point where I'm less and less an apprentice and more of an equal, and finally a colleague. And there's this rich sharing of faith and art as well as writing. And wow, it is, it's so wonderful. I think the songwriting plays into what I do with poetry. And um, I'm sort of embarrassed to confess this, but I think I am very susceptible to waltz time. And if
Hmm.
I'm not careful, I start hearing 3/4 or 6/8 in my head. And because I work with kind of a compressed line, and line breaks, shorter lines, I can fall into that rhythm and get too busy singing and lose sight of the meaning. So it's an interesting switch going between poetry, songwriting, and other types of writing. It seems like there's sort of a voice for each one and a rhythm that you want to explore. I just want to say, um, there are so many poets I greatly admire who have these elastic lines and this leisurely way with a line break and a conversational tone.
Hmm.
And I love it, but I just can't seem to settle into an ease with that kind of range for some reason. I don't know. Is it because I'm a type A?
Well,
I'm just, I just keep, you know, trying to get it to be as little, well, a good spine, but just enough connective tissue, maybe would
hmm.
be a way to say it.
You mean in terms of sound and like rhythm?
Yeah, but the meaning too, I think. I'm wanting to go for something a little more spare
Hmm.
than say when I write an essay. I'm much more leisurely and taking my time with a line.
Yeah.
That
Well,
answer
no,
your question?
yeah, yeah, it does. Yeah, I think that poetry tries to do a lot in a little bit of a space, you know. So it has to carry a lot of weight with every word. So
Yeah,
I think it's a good instinct, to be more minimalistic and just kind of let the emotion um just express itself naturally, you know.
well
But
said.
yeah. So we're here talking today about The House of 49 Doors. So that's the newest poetry book out from Stock. So why don't you just tell us a bit about it?
Okay, I'll show you a picture. Let me see. Is this all the way on my screen? Can
Yes,
you?
yeah, it looks gorgeous.
This is my house that I grew up in. It did have 49 doors and 72 windows when I lived there, and one skeleton key.
Hmm.
Um, if I had to say, you know how they will ask you to have your elevator pitch, can you say what your book is in 7 words? Um, I would say it's a festering 60-year family secret
Hmm.
going public. It's a search and rescue tale, but the perilous terrain is a child's memory and her heart, and that heart is mine. Um, there was a lot of pain in my family, marital strain, mental illness, um, post war trauma for both my father and my uncle. Uncle Dunkel was my childhood hero. He was my mom's baby brother, and he was magic. He was also a Korean War veteran, and he would later be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Um, I sometimes wonder, is this my story or is it my uncle's? And I think you could say either it's a tribute to him and his tragically short life. He died at 34. Um, I suppose it's somewhat a confessional on my part, but to me, I think the starring role is just the fiercely redemptive grace of God
Mm,
that is unfazed by chronological time, that will seek us out to restore us, to mend the places in us that are broken, the things that are buried and hidden, and that are keeping us from becoming what God hopes for our lives now. And so he will send that grace back in time. We're talking 60 years. The
mhm,
book only covers about 2 to 3 years, but that's how long since my uncle's tragic suicide. So the grace of God to me is the hero of the book.
mm. Yeah, that's extremely well said. Um, yeah, I think it's confessionals are hard. Um, it's incredibly hard to do them well. And I think that I think what the book does so well is that it does it in such a way that it's relatable without being solely inwardly focused, you
Oh,
know?
good.
Yeah. So I think that's where a book succeeds like this, and it does really. Um,
Thank you. That means
yeah,
a lot to me coming from you.
yeah. Now there are two different versions of you in the book. One of them is Kid Larkin, and then
Yeah.
the other is Elder
Elder girl.
Girl. Right.
Mm.
Yeah. Can you tell us about the decision to include like a younger version of yourself and an older version?
Yeah. When I originally started writing this, we had just come out of the pandemic. And before that, I had been really ill and quarantined with another really weird illness. And I was
Hmm.
so homesick for my childhood home and the magic of that. And I wanted to write about my house. Initially, I didn't want to write about the suicide. That was nowhere on my radar. I wanted to remember what it was like to be a kid
Mm,
in that house. And as it became apparent that, yes, I had to revisit my uncle's tragic death, I wanted to get at real emotion, not sentimentality, and not in a way that we had heard before. As
mm,
far as, I mean, so many people have this sad story of someone they love who take themselves out. And so I wanted some freshness. I was a kid with a big mouth. And, you know, I remember the teacher, I remember my teachers commenting on that and me going back to school with a Band-Aid over my mouth and making them really mad. That's a word rabbit trail. Um, Kid Larkin is pretty true to my younger self. And I think she was often bewildered. I think she was valiant, but very often very sad. And
mhm,
I also think she was half dazzled by the world and full of hope at times. And I thought if I could present the material that's darker, but do it in a way that disarmed and charmed my reader with this unexpected perspective, that I would have a better chance at perhaps helping a reader access things in their own life that might
mm,
carry a similarity. Elder Girl, that's all one word, which looks kind of sci-fi fantasy world to me. Um, and I hope I am Elder Girl, but I hope I'm Larkin as well. I'm
mm,
currently trying to sort of integrate those two more. I think Elder Girl can talk about hard-won wisdom and balance and faith in ways that the child self, is unable to do that. So there are even some poems where they're both in the same poem, and that was so interesting to do, to be in the young pre-teen voice and then to be in the 73-year-old voice, and
mhm,
to see where do they intersect on the page, and what do they have to say to each other? So I think I think I just stumbled onto the idea of the two voices, but I was so pleased with it, and it brought me a lot of healing.
Mm. Yeah, this reminds me of another poet named Laura McCullough. McCullough, I don't know how to say the last name, but we published her in Solum Journal Volume 4, and she had written an elegy for her mother, but it wasn't a typical one. It was she said the goal of it was to try to remember the whole person and not just one aspect. Um,
Yeah,
and I think that principle kind of applies to you making sense of the trauma in your childhood from the elder girl perspective. It's not
yeah,
just, romanticizing it. It's not just looking back on it with rose-colored glasses. It's approaching it, as it is. It's a very heavy, dark time for you, but but it's also hopeful. Um, and I think
oh,
that's what poetry does at its best, especially as
yeah,
Christians. Yeah. Now narrative. That's a big thing throughout this book. The narrative is kind of what is the glue that holds it all together, and that's pretty unique in poetry, unless you go back to the epics and whatnot. Especially nowadays with chapbooks, you don't usually see a narrative component. So I just
oh.
wanted to ask, like, do you regularly incorporate narrative into your poetry, or is that kind of a new thing for you?
Um, well, I do write lyric poems as well, and I experiment with other forms. But the thing is, for several decades, I was a professional storyteller.
Mm,
And so maybe I mentioned this earlier, I have such a feel for the narrative spine and just enough connective tissue to allow the imagination of the listener or the reader to fill in.
mhm,
And so I'm very drawn to story. And there is in the translation of the Bible called the Message. I know you'll probably know this verse, and I can't give you the exact location, but Jesus says, um, I tell stories to create readiness in people.
mm,
And I'm so struck by that there is an element of storytelling that is memorable. Um, of course, image alone sticks in our memory, but I am I'm susceptible to story. I love stories. I love to read, and so I think um, I wanted to have the storyline present in 49 Doors, but I also wanted, some other things to pop up that were part of Larkin's world, so it wouldn't just be straight memoir, but broken up into little chunks.
right.
Um, Sometimes I think to myself, it sounds pretty goofy, but it's sort of a novelish poemoir.
Yeah.
Uh, it's kind of its own animal in a way.
Hmm. Yeah, I think
I
that's very fair.
Yeah, I think the challenge for me, because you asked, I want to go back to your question. I'm not sure I quite answered it. Do I do narrative poetry a lot? Um, I think I'm very drawn to story and how something can lodge in us when we absorb a story. But for me, it's always a challenge to find the proportions. How much metaphor, how much narrative, um, how much image, and how do you balance that so that it's seamless for the reader to start with you, feel drawn in, get absorbed, and arrive somewhere.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, narrative imposes order on something. Uh, it's that's the main purpose of using a story is so I
Mm,
think it's a good use of it here too. And I think that the main, if I'm correct here, I think the main way that you use narrative, that you structure it, is actually based off the structure of a house. Um, so first off, am I right there? But it also, like, what's
yes.
what's the impetus behind that decision?
Oh, well, returning back to the post-pandemic times and being homesick for that house is part of it. But I was very intentional about revisiting mentally, revisiting different rooms and spaces because I was looking for the little stories, the little anecdotes that carried a charge. Um, and that was actually how I started moving more towards being able to incorporate the darker storyline within it. Because there
Mhm.
were emotions that just plain got buried in the basement, maybe below the basement. Um, so the structure of the house um, triggered a lot of the material. And then I thought it might be a really interesting way to invite the reader into my story via architecture, actual
Mm.
architecture, even some odd spaces like the clothes chute, maybe the more unexpected rooms and how story flowered there. There are two poems in the book, one at the beginning and then the penultimate poem that are written in the shape of a house.
Mhm.
And um, that was really fun to do, as was giving the house a voice.
Mm.
Uh, it just, again, gave me that sense of, yes, times in our family were very hard, but I was sheltered within those walls in such a unique way. I guess I wanted that sheltering to come across to the reader.
Mm. Yeah, I really love what you said about the house having a voice. Not it's not just a setting; it's almost like a character. Um, is
Yeah.
that kind of what you were going for?
Oh yes, it's a player. It's part of the cast in my
Mm.
mind. That house was just almost magical, and when the house actually speaks, it kind of feels like an alpha omega utterance to me.
Mm.
I was recently invited to share two poems from the book at our local Habitat for Humanity year-end fundraiser. And it was such a joy to do one poem from Kid Larkin's perspective, inviting people into the house, and then a slightly revised version for that occasion of the last poem, which kind of wraps it up with that whole idea of shelter and almost a companionship um,
Mm.
of the place where you grow up.
Mm. Yeah, and speaking of characters, it's interesting that it's not just Kid Larkin and Elder Girl that narrate, but it's also sometimes animals, like snails, and then there's the Vesper bat. It's all great stuff. So, can you tell us a bit about the decision to have them narrate as well?
I can. I even made myself a little list. I'm going to glance at it here because it was a really deliberate choice, um, partly to undercut the tragedy, just to have these little, refreshing utterances popping up.
Hmm.
But I also think that whimsical voice of the creature creates a little respite place, and it slows down the revelation of what the family secret is. So I think it might, um, someone said to me in a writing class, always take the reader where they don't want to go. And I don't know if that's always the best advice, but if you're getting more curious about what's happening, I feel the tension rising, with Uncle Dunkel, what's going to happen here? And then you meet one of the creatures that are part of the habitat where the characters interact. It's still connected, but it's a little time out and hopefully with a resonant nugget of truth that adds to who Larkin is, who her family is. And the last reason is a confession I would make, and that is I have a fear of many of God's creatures, and I don't like that about myself. But I'm not one to go right up and touch an animal or an insect or a snake or you know a wild well, not a wild thing that wouldn't be safe. But I had this notion that if I did some research about the creature because each of those creatures was a big part of my childhood, that I would understand them at least fractionally.
Hmm.
And it gave me the nerve to sort of jump in and attempt to speak for them. Am I less afraid of a bat getting stuck in my hair? I don't know. Ask me on Halloween.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'd be either. So you're in good company. Um, well, Laurie, at the end of the day, just what do you hope that people take away when they read House of 49 Doors?
Oh gosh. Grace is so patient, so gravitational. It'll travel such great lengths to set us free. And I guess I really hope that people might see glimpses of similarities in their own stories. I hope maybe they'll lay an old ghost. I
Mm,
hope, I really hope they rediscover and reclaim missing parts of their childhood self that still have a pulse, but maybe have been sidelined or, buried for a season. Um, because I think God is stirring us all to integrate the parts of ourselves, especially as we move into later life. That becomes more and more important. Um, when you realize the exit lane is coming up, or maybe a better way to say it is the on ramp to the next
mm,
uh, freeway to heaven.
mhm,
Um, yeah, so I hope it can be therapeutic in a
mm.
way that is still artful and engaging, but maybe inspiring to realize, boy, if God did that for her, I wonder what he'd do in my story if I looked into it, if I looked back.
Mm. Yeah, well, that is something that I question in my own life as I read the book. So I think you were successful in that. So yeah,
Thank you.
thank you for sharing this book with the world. Yeah, well, I always like to end our podcast with poets by asking just some practical questions for younger poets and poets that are just like trying to find their way in today's world. So now that you're a very firmly established poet,
You think so? Oh,
well,
I don't
you don't think so?
know. But thank
Well,
you for saying that. You made my day.
yeah, well, I mean, two books through open stock, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, that's pretty far along.
Thank you.
Um, but what advice, just in general, would you give to younger poets or beginner poets who are working on their own manuscripts right now?
Mm. It's such a worthwhile thing to do. I want to applaud each one of you. And I want to say, don't quit. And I want to say, read, 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 but don't forget to experiment. And sometimes it can be helpful to think of your manuscript as a prototype. It doesn't have to be the defining work of your life up until now. It takes a little pressure off to think, um, I'm going to play with this. I'm going to see where it takes me, and I'm going to think about these poems being on a hero journey, and I'm
Hmm.
going to submit these poems to a lot of places. These poems that I want to be in the manuscript, um, and that, of course, means you're going to hear a lot of yeses and a lot of nos. And I think it's so vital to keep sending things out. But when you think of a hero journey, that poem is on a hero journey. That means there's a quest. That means there's going to be trials. That means there's going to be an apprenticeship and insights along the way. Those poems maybe will come back to you from the editor with a few suggestions, and you return them back, and then they're published. And then an eventual homecoming. That's sort of the barest bones of the hero journey. But it honors your work to think of it in those terms rather than, oh man, I'm a rookie, I'm so green, how do I get started? We'll start small,
Mm,
stand and build relationships with other writers and editors as you're able. Um, you can tell the ones that will want to interact with you and nurture those things because they may end up endorsing your book. Um, I have a quote here. May I read it?
yeah,
Let's see.
please.
Um, I want to say write poems that change you. Kind of
Mm,
like sometimes we think we pray to change circumstances or to change God's mind, but maybe sometimes we pray to change ourselves. That's the fruit of it. And ego is wily and ambition can kill. I just read this from Christian Wyman this morning, which was why I wanted to include it. Um, it's always seemed to me, he says, the greatest compliment for a poet is if someone would come up to you and have your poem memorized, but not know who you were. They just had the poem itself. That seems the greatest honor and freedom because the poem has done the work. You're no longer involved. You're out of the picture. It's not about you. The poem is in motion
mm,
and it's doing its work in the world. I think when you get a yes from an editor, I'm always I'm always thrilled. Oh, even if I get a new subscriber to my blog, I'm so happy, I'm so grateful. And then there's this sneaker wave right behind it that almost always presents itself and it voices itself as finally I'm on my way.
mm.
And then when the no's roll in, what do I do with that? Oh, I guess maybe I'm nowhere after all. Whatever you are hearing, dear poets, from people with publishing power, um, keep sending out. Keep sending out. And it's really a good idea to pray blessing over them, over their staff, and over their work aside from the magazine,
Mm,
because it will keep your heart more humble. It will keep you open and available. Some people say you got to grow a thick skin. If you grow too thick of a skin, it becomes a callus. And then how do you write poetry that's drenched with emotion that's contagious when
mm,
someone reads it? Um, don't go with the thickest skin as you're sending your manuscript out, which is, um, oh gosh, it's so precious to you. It's your life. I want to say that quote again, may I, from
yeah.
Monk Kid. Grace needs an arena like you in
Mm.
which to incarnate.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think you're hitting on too that even submitting poetry is a spiritual discipline. It is part of just your spiritual health, your spiritual life, your spiritual walk with God. And we shouldn't just neglect that for the sake of ambition or anything like that.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that. Would you say that again? I just want to absorb that more deeply.
Yeah. It's submitting poetry is a spiritual discipline in a way. It's very
Yeah.
important to include that in your walk with God because everything you do is in your walk with God. So,
Yes,
yeah.
that is beautiful.
Well, thank
I've
you.
never heard it put that way, and I am going to carry that right here. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Laurie. I pray for the success of House of 49 Doors. It's already touched my life. I know it's going to touch a bunch of people's lives. So thank you for
So
your
much
bravery and
fun.
sharing, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you for listening. Bye bye.